It's September 15, 2022. I'm Todd Dunn, and today I'm down at the Great Harbor Marina, and what I want to do is the first video in a series about what to look for if you're considering buying an Allied Princess 36. So today's video is going to be a bit of a discussion of sailing characteristics and a little bit about the rig. I'll do a much more detailed video about the rig separately. All right, I'm down below in the main salon, out of the wind, and I want to talk a little bit about the sailing characteristics of the Allied Princess 36 ketch. Now, I'm not going to talk about the sloop because I actually have never seen an Allied sloop, and I certainly have never sailed on one, so I don't really know much about how well they sail. But I know a lot about the ketch because I've been sailing this ketch for 27 years. So I picked up a little bit during that time. Anyway, this is a half-hull model of an Allied Princess 36. This is my boat, and I want to show you this to show you a couple of things. One is the hull form below the waterline. Notice the Allied has a full keel with a cutaway forefoot, and it has an attached rudder, a barn door style rudder. Now, those two details of the underbody of the boat have a big impact on how the boat sails, and I'll get to that in just a second. Okay, so obviously this boat is a ketch, and so I'll give you a couple of rig details and some information about the sails, and then we'll talk about how the boat sails and what you can expect sailing one of these boats. It's two deck step masts. The fact that the masts are deck stepped doesn't have a huge effect on the sailing characteristics, other than deck step masts are in general a little bit heavier spars than keel step masts, and consequently that puts a little bit more weight aloft and is going to make the boat a little more tender than if the masts were keel stepped. But since none of these boats have keel step masts, it's not really a comparison you can make. But if compared to an identical boat with keel step masts, the deck step mast boat will be slightly more tender. Now, how big are the masts? The main mast is 40 feet long, and the masthead is about 46 feet off the water. And if you have any antennas or anything up there, you're probably going to have a bridge clearance of about 48 feet. Now, the mizzen is 30 feet long, and its step is about 5 feet lower than the main mast step. So it's actually, the mast head is almost 15 feet lower than the main mast head. So what about the sails? Normally, you're going to have 3 sails on one of these boats. You're going to have a jib of some sort, usually a Genoa. And I would say that on a typical Allied 36, the Genoa is probably going to be 135%. And it's going to be around 300 to 335 square feet of sail area. The main has a hoist of about 36 feet, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little less. It just depends on how your particular sail is cut. And the boom is about 13 feet long. So that's a fairly low aspect mainsail. My main is 250 square feet. And the mizzen has a hoist of about 22 to 23 feet, depending on exactly where you have the boom located. It is movable if you want. And the foot is 8.5 feet. And my mizzen is 95 square feet. So in a typical Allied Princess ketch, you're going to have about 680 square feet of sail, which is a reasonable amount of sail to move this boat along. Now, And if you decide to sail it without the main, you're going to be down around 430 square feet of sail area. So what are the impacts of that? Well, one impact, going back to the underbody, is that because of the long keel, the boat tracks quite well. It isn't, say, squirrely. It isn't sort of zip around. It will track very nice straight lines. However, because of the attached rudder, it isn't as responsive as it would be if it had a fin keel and a spade rudder. When you put the helm over, it takes a while for this boat to turn. And in my experience sailing this boat, when I tack, I usually put the bow through the wind and let the wind fill the jib and push it across before I cast off. And that has two effects. It gets the sail over to the other side of the mainmast, and the load on the jib pushes the bow around. If I cast off before the jib has crossed the center line, the boat can actually stall during attack and you end up in irons. Particularly because then your mizzen sail will have a big effect and can counteract the turning effect of the rudder. And in fact, in heavy air, if you're sailing and you want to tack, sometimes you'll actually have to cast off the mizzen to get through the wind, because the wind on the mizzen can stall the boat during the tack, which can be kind of annoying if you're not prepared for it. So these boats don't tack fast, they don't turn fast, and they're not super maneuverable under sail. I mean, they will, you can drive them through a field of other boats without too much difficulty, but because of the fact that it isn't a very sprightly handling boat, I don't like to sail it in the mooring field where the boats are closely spaced. Simply because if I have to turn suddenly, well, the boat may not make it. What about general sailing conditions? Well, the hull with the full keel has a lot of surface area, wetted surface area, and that means that in light air, this boat is pretty slow. It takes a lot of sail area to get the boat moving in light air, and particularly downwind. My boat is much slower downwind than it is upwind. And in my experience, this particular boat's fastest point of sail is close hauled. And the hull speed, based on the 27 and a bit foot waterline length, is about 7 knots. And I can achieve that without any difficulty on this boat, and actually have hit peak speeds on the boat of about 7.8. I don't recall ever having hit 8 knots. GoPro, stop recording. Now, another thing about the boat, as I mentioned, in light air, it's not a particularly fast boat, and it isn't a fast boat under really any conditions, although if you got a good deal of wind, it will get up and go quite well. Plus, Allied Princesses are relatively heavy for their size. They're between 14,500 and 15,500 pounds, depending on the vintage of the boat. The newer boats built after about 1978 are heavier because they have an additional 1,000 pounds of ballast. The boats are initially tender when you're sailing. That if you're out in about 10 knots or so of wind, the boat will heel up to about 15 degrees pretty easily, and then it sort of firms up. And it can go further than that. In big puffs, I have had this boat over almost 40 degrees. But there's one aspect of it, because it has relatively high freeboard, particularly at the bow, the boat's actually very dry, and I have never, in 27 years of sailing this boat, in all sorts of wind conditions, put the rail down. It just won't go down. The boat sort of lies over on its side, but the rail does not go below the water level. I mean, I have taken spray on deck when it was rough and the wind was blowing pretty hard, but never put the rail down and have water flowing across the side deck. And I have been out in some pretty big air, over 40 knots, and that just isn't an issue on these boats. Now, as I said, the boat is initially tender, and if you don't like sailing heeled over 20-25 degrees, you're going to want to reef the main fairly early. I mean, I would, when I was using my mainsail, which I no longer do for reasons that have nothing to do with how the boat sails, I tended to reef between 12 and 15 knots. And if it went much above, say, 17, 18 knots, I dropped the main completely and sailed with the mizzen and the Genoa only. And if the wind picked up more than that, I would start rolling the Genoa up. Maybe 3 turns at 20 knots, maybe 4 or 5 turns at 25, and a little bit more if it got above 20, much above 25. And if the wind was really piping up and I had the Genoa significantly rolled up, I would put a reef in the mizzen. Because if it's blowing pretty hard and you've got the Genoa rolled up till it's pretty small, the mizzen, if you have the full mizzen sail up, can overpower the Genoa. And that will tend to point the boat up, and it becomes very difficult to fall off without casting the mizzen sail off and letting it luff. And that will have, flapping sail back there, and also that will slow you down quite a bit, because when you're sailing with the mizzen and a Genoa, you do get a fair amount of push from the mizzen sail. So, over maybe 27, 28 knots, I put a reef in the mizzen so that I don't overpower a partly furled Genoa. Then the boat is easy to balance up and I can sail it more or less normally. And if you reef down appropriately, you can keep the boat on its feet without too much trouble. Although in big puffs it will heel over, but any boat does that. Now, what about pointing? Well, it's not a fin keel with a spade rudder. It won't point to a 30-degree angle of apparent wind. It just won't do that. With full sail up, you can point to somewhere between 40 and 45 degrees of apparent wind. And when you reef the main, you're going to lose some pointing ability, and if you start to furl up the jib, you're going to lose quite a bit of pointing ability because you start losing sail shape when you partly roll up the jib. And if you sailing as I do without the main, with just the Genoa and the mizzen, I'd say this boat will point to about 45 degrees, is about as high as it'll go. That's apparent wind. But it will point there fairly consistently, and it actually points better when the wind is stronger. In light air, she doesn't point well at all, partly because the boat is going very slowly and the keel doesn't work very well. We don't get a lot of keel lift, which makes it difficult to get the boat to point up high. So, let me say a little bit about sailing without the main. Now, I sail that way because, 1, it's really easy. 2, I can set sail and douse sails without ever leaving the cockpit for any reason. And that's the main reason that I do it that way. Well, largely because I'm not young anymore. My balance isn't as good as it used to be. I'm not very sprightly when it comes to moving around on a pitching and heeling sailboat deck, and I just would prefer not to do that. That means the boat doesn't go very fast in light air, but when we get up above about 10 to 12 knots, the boat sails just fine without the main, and it will stand up very well without the main up to the better part of 20 knots. And then I start rolling the Genoa up a little bit. Now, of course, without the main, as I said, you lose some pointing ability because you don't get the slot effect of wind funneling between the Genoa and the mainsail, since obviously the mainsail, in my case, is at home in my garage. So that affects pointing, and it also, for a given wind speed, makes the boat quite a bit slower. But heeling is much less pronounced without the main. And particularly when you start rolling the jib up, because rolling the jib up lowers its center of effort quite a bit, and that will, can really decrease heeling. And I find the boat very comfortable and easy to sail without the mainsail. And the only time I ever kind of wish I still had the mainsail on the boat is in light air, and especially going downwind. One of my sort of jokes about this boat is that going downwind without the mainsail, I might as well have just anchored off the stern for all the speed I'm going to get. Sometimes I feel like I'm just sitting there. Although if there's good breeze, the boat will move right along. But I've never really seen more than about 6.5 knots downwind, when upwind in the same conditions I was making 7.5. It's not at all unusual on anything from a beam reach higher, say in 12 to 15 knots of wind, to be able to hit 6.5 to 7 knots of boat speed. And so the boat, it's slow in light air. It doesn't accelerate fast. It doesn't turn fast. But if you got a little wind, it'll move right along. And I sometimes surprise people in lighter fin-keeled boats who figure they can run away from me, say in 15 knots of wind, and they find out that they can't. Unless it's a very light boat and can actually surf or something like that. But say a Catalina 36 can't get away from me in 15 knots of wind if we're both sailing in a close reach. But if the wind drops off, I'm going to be waving goodbye to them as they sail away from me. So anyway, what about motion? The boat has a nice, relatively easy motion. It does not like short, steep seas, though. With the high freeboard forward and the flare in the bow, short, steep waves get the boat pitching quite a bit, and it will plow into a wave, and sometimes, say in 4 or 5 foot seas, it'll almost stop when it hits a short, steep wave. And it's quite an uncomfortable ride beating into what I would call moderate seas, 4 to 5, maybe 6 feet, particularly if they're close spaced. But less than that in terms of seas, the boat handles it very well. And as I said, it's quite dry. The cockpit is very dry. I have seldom gotten any water on me unless the wind was blowing hard enough that I blew spray from crashing into waves up over the Dodger. But in normal conditions, the cockpit is completely dry. Now, one other aspect of sailing this boat that you have to get used to is that that affects the pointing ability is the Genoa is sheeted to blocks on the tow rails. It does not have inboard sheeting, so it doesn't have a tight sheeting angle, and that's one of the factors that affects the pointing ability. Now, I suppose you could install some tracks on the side decks inside the shrouds and get it to point a little higher, but I don't think you'd get much benefit from it, simply because the keel is not as effective as a fin keel, and you just won't let you point that much higher. So you just have to live with that. I have a fairly high cut, almost a Yankee, for my Genoa, so that I can see under the sail when I'm sailing, which I find useful, particularly here in Maine, because we don't have that many other boats to avoid, but we do have lobster gear. And if you're heeled over a bit and you have a deck sweeper jib, you're not going to see any lobster gear on the lee side, and you're probably going to end up getting fouled in it if you're not careful. Now this boat, because of the full keel, the attached rudder, and the fact that the prop is in an aperture between the keel and the rudder, doesn't snag lobster gear very much. I sail with the transmission locked in reverse so the prop won't turn, so that if I do get a lobster pot line that runs along the side of the keel and snags on my prop, it's just snagged usually on one blade, and all I have to do is turn toward the side that it's snagged on to get off. Now, most of the time I don't get snagged. I have had exactly one snag in the last 5 years. So in summary, this is a fairly comfortable boat to sail once you recognize that it's not a fin keel spade rudder racing boat. It has a lot of wetted surface area, which makes it slow in light air, particularly downwind. It doesn't turn very fast, but you get used to that. And I can tack successfully in 1 or 2 knots of wind. It sometimes just takes 90 seconds. You just have to live with it. It doesn't point super high, so if you're, you may have to tack a few extra times if you're headed for a particular upwind location, but you'll get there, particularly because I find the boat sails fastest upwind. Go figure, most people would say it shouldn't, but in my experience, it does. And, it's relatively tender initially. 10, 15 degrees of heel is pretty typical. But the cockpit is quite comfortable for that. However, if you get hit by a puff, it can go over considerably more. 30 knot gust will put the boat with reduced sail over 30 degrees. Which gets stuff sliding across the cockpit and gets my wife telling me to stand the boat up, but it's never been a problem. And as I said, I have never in 27 years of sailing this boat here in Maine put the rail down. And the boat is quite dry, and if you want a go fast boat that can zip around, you can just turn the wheel a little bit and the boat will spin on a dime. This is not the boat that you want. If you want a boat that's comfortable, solidly built, can handle more than you can, but isn't super fast, doesn't point super high, well, then this isn't a bad boat for you. At least that would be my recommendation. Now, in light air, there are other things you can do. You can rig a mizzen staysail. I have one, I've never used it. It's kind of a pain to rig, but that'll give you some extra power at light air. And I also have an asymmetrical spinnaker, which I don't use much. I've used it maybe half a dozen times in 27 years, and that will give you quite a bit more power in light air. So you can power the boat up in light air by flying additional sails. And you can be out there in light air with an asymmetrical up, main up, mizzen staysail up, and mizzen up, and move along quite reasonably. Of course, that means you're going to have to be pretty close to downwind, probably below a beam reach, to fly that asymmetrical, and probably maybe a little bit below a beam reach to get much effect out of a mizzen staysail. Plus, it's going to give you a lot of extra lines to pull. So anyway, that kind of, I hope that illustrates what you can expect from one of these boats when you're sailing it. I think that if you don't expect, super maneuverability and, fast tacks and pointing to 25 degrees relative, you'll be quite happy with an Allied Princess. If you do expect those things, don't buy an Allied Princess, because it will never achieve any of those things. Another aspect of it that isn't sailing, but that's maneuvering under power. The boat maneuvers reasonably well under power, except in reverse. When I back the boat out of the slip here, it's anybody's guess where it's going to go. I have put the helm over hard to starboard in an attempt to get the stern to go to starboard when I backed out, and had the stern go to port. Basically, until you get moving fairly fast, the rudder doesn't do much for you, and in reverse, the boat pretty much goes where it wants, not where you want, and you have to get used to that. If you're in a marina, it can make getting in and out of a slip a little tricky. If you try to back into a slip, you're definitely going to want somebody on the finger pier to take lines, because your chance of succeeding if you have a fairly narrow slip in reverse is pretty small. Coming in on forward, the boat works pretty well. I take advantage of the fact that when you are coming in at low speed in forward, that when you put the boat in reverse and give it a little bit of power, prop walk will swing the stern to port. So I always come in to my finger pier, which is on the port side of the boat, bow in, and then when I go to stop, it will swing the stern in and the bow away. And if I time everything right, the boat stops right where I want it to, and I just step off and tie the mooring lines up. So I don't always manage that, but if I do, it's very, very easy to dock the boat. So those are some of the characteristics of this boat under sail and under power. I should mention one other thing about under power. These boats originally had a 27 horsepower diesel engine, which was a bit underpowered for the weight of this boat. Yeah, it would move the boat comfortably at 5 knots, but if you had a headwind and some big seas, you probably wouldn't get much above 5 knots if you could even achieve 5 knots. I currently have a Westerbeek 46, which is 46 horsepower, turning a 3-blade fixed prop, and the boat will power into pretty much anything at up to hull speed of 7 knots. I usually run at about 6 knots, and in normal conditions at 6 knots, the boat burns just under half a gallon of diesel an hour. So it isn't a big fuel hog. You can motor for a full 8-hour day and use less than 5 gallons of fuel, unless you're in a hurry and want to push the boat up to hull speed. And then you're going to burn a lot more fuel, just because of the fact that fuel consumption curves for sailboats are exponential. They don't just go up linearly, they go up like that as boat speed increases. But as long as you're happy to go around 6 knots, half a gallon an hour is a pretty reasonable estimate of how much fuel you use. Okay, hope you found this interesting and that it gives you some more information about an Allied Princess 36 if you're considering buying one. And if you did find that to be the case, please give me a thumbs up. And if you subscribe to my channel and click that notification bell, you'll find out when the next video in this series, which is going to be a detailed discussion of various characteristics of an Allied to look for if you're thinking about buying one. So if you subscribe and click that notification bell, you'll find out when the next video is up, and you can get a lot more information over the next few weeks about the Allied Princess 36. Thanks for watching.